A special welcome to everyone here today. We've been celebrating the library's 100th anniversary this year and invite you to pick up a copy of The Town of Leesburg Celebrates Thomas Balch Library's 100 Years. Copies of the current Balch column, listing programs, classes, tours, and exhibits are available on the table in the back of the room, along with other informative literature about the library. Events are posted on our website and on social media. The spring newsletter, as well as all the back issues of our newsletter, may be accessed in their entirety on our website. The water fountain is out the door to the left. Restrooms are straight back. And if you have any electronic devices, please turn off or mute at this time. Masks are not required. If anyone wishes one, you may find them on the table in the back. This event is being recorded and will be made available on the library's YouTube in the very near future. It is my pleasure to welcome back our guest speaker, Wynne Saffer, a lifelong Loudoun resident who will discuss the history of land grants of the Northern Neck Proprietary and how to locate grants using resources available at Thomas Balch Library. Saffer has completed numerous local research projects, mapped the county by land ownership in 1860, and written several books about Loudoun's history, including Loudoun Votes 1867 to 1966, A Civil War Legacy, and Mount Zion Cemetery, Aldie, Virginia. Saffer is a recipient of the Thomas Balch Library's Loudoun History Award. Please join me in welcoming Wynne Saffer.
I've made this presentation, this will be the fourth time. I presented twice at Thomas Balch Library, and I also presented once to the Lovettsville Historical Society. So I've been through it a few times, and I'm very familiar with what the program's all about. But if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer those, and just raise your hand if you have a question at the time. Let's see, I'll skip on here to the next slide. This is a map that came out a number of years ago. I'd hate to guess how many. It was a flyer that was in the mail, and they were trying to sell a reproduction of the map of the Northern Neck Proprietary by one of the descendants of Thomas sixth Lord Fairfax. And I didn't buy the map. All I have is the flyer, and that's what I reproduced this from. I think it says here what the price was, but I decided that was a little too pricey. It was $125 at the time. That I say this is a number of years ago, and they were doing it as a fundraiser. So that's a color map that was produced of the Northern Neck Proprietary. I'm going to first tell you a little history, though, about the Northern Neck Proprietary, and then I'm going to talk more about the grant process and how that all worked. So this is the fellow that owned all this land, and his name is Thomas sixth Lord Fairfax. And he will be the eventual owner of the Northern Neck Proprietary. But the story starts a little bit, well, before he got the ownership. Can you tell me who the current King of England is?
Charles.
And what number is he, do you know? Charles III is the current King of England. The proprietary starts with Charles II of England. So a tie into the present king. Charles II would be the person that creates the Northern Neck Proprietary, but it resulted from the death of his father, Charles I of England. Charles I of England was beheaded by Oliver Cromwell, and he took charge. And Charles II, his son, who was just a young man. Good morning. Get you a handout at the back of the room, Casey.
Thanks. Sorry.
Anyway, so Charles II had fled to France. Going back into history, I remember being a school kid learning about the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. Well, Charles I was a Cavalier, and Oliver Cromwell was the leader of the Roundheads, the Puritans. And so it was a monarchy prior to beheading Charles I. And then when Cromwell took over in England, it was no longer a monarchy, it was a Commonwealth country. Anyway, that happened in 1649. Well, Charles II, when he was in France, decided he wanted to reward people that were supporting him. And there were 6 loyal citizens of England that he felt greatly indebted to, so he made an award to them of land in the colonies, the American colonies. And this was in 1649 that he decided to give them this land, and it would be between the heads of the Potomac River and the Rappahannock River. Now today, I don't know if y'all are familiar, but when you go down to Washington, D.C., you cross the bridges, that's the Potomac River, it takes you into Washington, D.C., and if you go down to Fredericksburg, you'll cross the bridges down there on 95, that's the Rappahannock River, or if you're in the city of Fredericksburg, you cross the Rappahannock River again on Route 17. And anyway, those are the 2 rivers that were known of, was the Potomac and the Rappahannock. But the headwaters, or the heads as they call them, nobody knew where that is. Later that'd be termed the springs. So they had no idea where all this land was, other than it was in the colony of Virginia, somewhere northwest of Jamestown. Jamestown was founded in 1607. So move forward to 1660, Charles II regains power. So when Charles II regains power, now his grant of land that he made to these loyal supporters is now in effect. He's now the king, and he can make sure they get this land. Prior to 1660, he was still in France, so he couldn't have helped them out, even though he had granted them all this land. He had no power because he wasn't on the throne, but he regained the throne in 1660. In 1688, a new king is on the throne, James II, and he issues a new patent for the same land that was previously patented to these gentlemen by King Charles II. So here it says issues to Lord Culpeper. Originally there were 6 noblemen who got this award. 2 of them were the Culpeper brothers. I don't know off my head the names of the other 4, but I could refer you to a book upstairs that has those names in it. Anyway, those 6 men had combined their interests. So Lord Culpeper is the prime controller of those 6 interests by 1688 when James II gives the new grant. And then in 1690, Lady Culpeper marries Thomas V, Lord Fairfax. And that brings us next to the 5th Lord Fairfax. Let me see, I don't think I messed up there, did I? No? Okay. Haven't got to Thomas VI Lord Fairfax yet. King Carter is appointed agent to handle the sales of the grants in 1702. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Robert King Carter, but Robert King Carter was reputedly the wealthiest man in the colonies. And he was on the executive council for Virginia. At that time, all the colonies in the states, their governors were being appointed by the king. And so the governor of Virginia was appointed by the king, so was the lieutenant governor. And then there was an executive council of wealthy landowners that was appointed also by the king. And Robert Carter was a member of that, and he was also chairman of that executive committee. And so he was a very prominent person in Virginia, and Lord Fairfax appointed him to handle his grants. I have to point out to you, one of the issues that's taken place at this point in time is that the Northern Neck Proprietary belonged to the Culpepers. And at this point, it had passed down to Thomas V Lord Fairfax. Well, the rest of the state of Virginia, the land that's in there is granted out by the state. So the state controls most of the land in Virginia, and Fairfax just controls the Northern Neck. But they still, at this point in 1702, don't know exactly where that land that includes the Northern Neck is. They know it's between the headwaters of the Potomac River and the Rappahannock River, but there's still some question as to where that cuts off and where the state land comes in. So by having a prominent person who's on the Executive Council of Virginia helps give a little leverage to Lord Fairfax in figuring out where his land is versus where the state's land is. And in 1722 is another important date, is the Treaty of Albany. The Treaty of Albany was between the colonists and the Native Americans. At that time it was known as, I think, the Five Nations. And that was up in New York State where the Five Nations were located. And they were an Indian tribe. All this land that had been granted, even the land that Virginia's granting out, the Indians still claim it as their land. So when they're giving land out to people, it's on the wilderness and the frontier where Indians live and hunt. And so people moving out to this land are at risk of their lives if the Indians come along while they're there. But the Treaty of Albany opens the doors for a lot of the white settlers, because by that treaty, the Indian tribes agreed not to come east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. So at that point in time, the frontier was moved from east of the mountains to west of the mountains. Even though the Northern Neck is going to extend beyond the Blue Ridge to the west, at least people on this side of the mountain can feel like if they take their land up and start settling it, that they won't end up giving up their lives to Indians coming through. So that's a key date when it opens up for white settlement. In 1732, Robert Carter dies and is replaced by William Fairfax as an agent. I think William Fairfax is a nephew of Lord Fairfax, but I'm not sure about that relationship. But William Fairfax lived at a place in Fairfax County known as Belvoir. Now again, I'm talking about Fairfax County. I haven't mentioned Loudoun County. In 1731, Prince William is created from Stafford County. But prior to that, when the Treaty of Albany, all this, we're in Prince William County, or we're in Stafford County at that point in time. So when Treaty of Albany comes up, this part of the country is all part of Stafford County. So in 1735, Thomas VI Lord Fairfax arrives in Virginia. Up until then, he lived in England. He owned all this land in the colonies and was dependent upon agents like King Carter to distribute his land for him. And they would sell the land. Now, I want to make a point here about how the process worked to some degree, because I think you need to know that. It's not part of the history, but the agent would have people come to him and have a warrant issued to purchase property. They would say, I want 300 acres. And they would generally say where they wanted the land at. So then surveyors would be hired and sent out with a group of chain carriers, and they would go back out into the wilderness and they'd survey off 300 acres. If you wanted 500 acres, they'd survey off 500 acres. So depending upon where you wanted the land and how much land you wanted, they'd send a survey crew out there. They would have already issued a warrant saying that you're going to be able to buy this much land. And after the survey crew returns, then you'd be issued a grant. So you get the grant after the warrant and the survey. So there's 3 steps. There's the warrant, the survey, and the grant. And you pay a fee, they call it a composition fee, where you're paying so much per acre and you're also paying for the work of the surveyors that went out there. So you pay that to acquire your land.
I'm sorry, what was that called again?
Excuse me?
After the, so the.
So you have the warrant, then the survey, and then the grant. So the grant is the final. Now, with a grant, you're actually being sold land, so you become the owner. These grants are recorded in the office of Lord Fairfax. So he's maintaining his grant books in his office. The state of Virginia does the same thing for state land. But he has his office and they have theirs. And as I said, William Fairfax by this time had become his agent, and his office was in Belvoir. That was the name of his plantation, which is now part of Fort Belvoir in Fairfax County. So that's where William Fairfax was living, and that's where the grant books were maintained at that. Prior to that, when King Carter was the land agent, he kept the records at his house. All right. So the state of Richmond, or the state where the capital's in Richmond, or prior to that, Williamsburg or Jamestown, is not connected with the Northern Neck grants. They're maintained elsewhere. The state grants are maintained where the state capital is. And those grant books today are at the Library of Virginia. So they hold those records today. But when Lord Fairfax arrives in 1735, he wants to make sure where his land is and how much he's got. So he asked to have a committee appointed to go out and survey the land. And on the committee are a group of people. Some of them are representing Lord Fairfax, and others are representing the Commonwealth of Virginia. Because basically what's going to happen is the more land Fairfax gets, the less land the state of Virginia will have, and vice versa. If they reduce the amount of land he has by the survey, then the state of Virginia will benefit from it. So there's a kind of a competition there between these two groups. So they send representatives from both out to do the survey. And it's agreed that the springs of these two rivers, Rappahannock and Potomac, are going to be the end point, and then that'll determine where the survey is. They know where the mouths of those rivers are that flow into the bay. Now the question, to a large degree, is where are those rivers? Today we know where those rivers are, but back in the 1700s there was some doubt about what rivers were where. One of the major branches of the Rappahannock River is the Rapidan. And what is the primary course of the Rappahannock and what is the course of the Rapidan? This hadn't been determined. They were still trying to figure out which stream was the river base. And the same happens when you go to Harper's Ferry. The Shenandoah River flows into the Potomac. Is the Shenandoah part of the Potomac? Is that where the Potomac's headwaters are? Or is it the Potomac, which we know today is Potomac? So these things all had to be determined by these surveyors as far as which water body was the primary source of this river. And when you came back to Potomac, there was another party involved with the state of Maryland. Lord Baltimore had been granted the state of Maryland, and the state of Maryland is everything north of the Potomac. South of Potomac is Virginia. So if the Shenandoah River was determined to be the headwaters of the Potomac, then Maryland would be getting a lot more land than what they have today. So all of those were things that were uncertain or unknown at the time, because there really wasn't a lot of white settlement out in that area of the state. Now, I'll point out one of the things that happened, haven't time-wise quite get there, but one of the first counties that was created up here was Frederick County, and that was created in 1738. So west of the mountains, there are counties, but it's still Augusta County out west of the Blue Ridge. There were settlers coming down from north, from Pennsylvania, coming down the wagon road, but there weren't a whole lot of settlers out there. One of the stories in history is with the Shenandoah Valley. When the Treaty of Albany was created and the Indians agreed to stay west of the mountains, they were still active west of the mountains in what's the Shenandoah Valley today. Frederick County would be the county seat of Winchester. There were a lot of Indian activity up there. And they say that a lot of grants were made out there to the Quakers and the Scotch Irish, because the English down in Tidewater didn't care how many Scotch-Irish or Quakers were massacred by the Indians. That wasn't their people. So again, that was kind of the attitude of the people in Virginia, was that's still frontier, that's still dangerous territory. Bring these people from across the ocean that weren't part of our family and let them be the buffer between us and the Indian population. And the Scotch-Irish were very hardy, and they were used to fighting, and they didn't mind holding their ground out there against the Indians. And the Quakers were pretty good at dealing with. They used to pay the Indians for the land. Because again, the English believed they owned all this land, but so did the Indians. So there was still a disagreement as to ownership of land between the Native Americans and the white population. Well, the survey was done, and in 1745, the Privy Council in London confirmed the boundaries of the Proprietary, which contains over 5 million acres. And there's a plat of the land, and today we refer to this area down here as the Northern Neck of Virginia. So Fredericksburg is right along in here on the Rappahannock River. This is the Rappahannock River right here. This is the Potomac River here. So Fredericksburg right about here. And then these are the counties that are out on the Northern Neck. Today we refer to that to Northern Neck, but all of this land is known as the Northern Neck Proprietary. And this is the Potomac River going up on the top here and all the way to here. This is the head springs of the Potomac River right at that line right there. And then down here is the head spring of the Rappahannock River. And this line right here is what they call the Fairfax line. And that's where they just closed the survey between those 2 points. So he ended up with all this land, which turned out to be about 5 million acres. Now this drawing, which was the same as that original plat I showed you earlier, this is a colorful one here. That's a basic black and white thing. That came out of an article from the Virginia Cavalcade magazine of winter 1967. That was the year I got out of high school. Anyway, I bought this later. I didn't get this when I was in high school. It's called Manners on the Frontier by Stuart E. Brown, Jr. The Northern Neck Proprietary was a feudal grant in Virginia. And that's part of the historical record that I need to point out, is that when we think about land, if you went to someone today and bought a piece of property from them and they had full ownership to convey title to you, you'd own the land. Well, back in this time frame, you did own the land, but there were some restrictions on it. All right? When Lord Fairfax granted you land, he retained the gold and silver rights. So if you had any gold you discovered on your property, it belonged to Lord Fairfax. It wasn't yours. And if you found silver, it was his as well. So he held back certain rights, but also one of the other rights he got was you had to pay him an annual quit rent. Q-U-I-T is the way it's spelled, quit rent. And you paid so much for every 50 acres of land you owned to him annually. And if you didn't pay that quit rent for 3 consecutive years, he could re-grant the land to someone else. So you weren't guaranteed to keep that land forever unless you kept paying the quit rent every year to Lord Fairfax. So one of the things that's interesting in this whole process is that he wasn't making it very expensive for people to buy this land out in the frontier, because every person he sold land to meant he had annual money coming in towards him. So the more land he could distribute, the better his pocketbook would be. So he got a lot of money from quit rents. And as I say, if you didn't pay him 3 years in a row, he could basically take the land back and give it to somebody else. So it was a money-making proposition for Lord Fairfax. and he was getting this annual payment. We didn't have property taxes in Virginia at that time, so there's no property tax. There was the tithables that were paid by the citizens of Virginia, which was a tax that was paid to the Church of England, or the Anglican Church of Virginia, and you were paying an annual tithable to them, a head tax, for each white person over 16, each white male over 16, and each slave over 16, both male and female. Question?
Yes, who collects the quit rents and where, how is that?
I believe he had agents that went around and collected those. We didn't have really a very good mail or postal system back then, so I think they would send people around that were representative of him. As I said, he didn't arrive in the colonies till 1736, and later he will move to Clark County. It was Frederick County at the time, but it's Clark County today, to a place called White Post. I don't know if y'all know where White Post is, but it's just over the mountain on 340 there in Clark County. And that's where he would live, at a place called Greenway Court. And then he would take over handling, issuing the grants at his office over there in Clark County and take it away from his nephew, William. So he would no longer handle it after he moved over there. But this was the survey they came up with that established how much land he had and where his land was, and that was approved in 1745, yes?
Was this, was the quit rent process pretty standard throughout the colonies at this time? Was it specific to the Atlantic or the South, or was this happening everywhere?
I don't know the answer to that, Casey. Lord Fairfax established how much the quit rent was, and it was established in the grant. I've got a copy of one of the grants here I'll read from, okay. All right, you're to pay to the proprietor of the Northern Neck yearly, and every year on the feast of St. Michael the Archangel, they're on rent of 1 shilling sterling money for every 50 acres of land hereby granted. So he has set that, and it's documented in the grant that he gave to you. If there was any quit rents in Virginia or any other colonies, they'd be established, I guess, by those states. But again, the thing with Lord Fairfax, he'd been granted this by the King of England, so he was able to obtain this quit rent from these people he was granting land to. People south of here in Virginia, if there was any quit rents, they'd be paid to the state. I do know from a genealogical standpoint, some people use these quit rent lists to establish, that their ancestors are here at a given period in time. So there are quit rent lists available out there that have been published, and they can look to see if they're paying rents. Of course, obviously, in genealogy, you'll have to tie that person to you, but still, there are lists out there that establish people are here and are paying rent on the lands. So out of this 5 million acres, a number of counties were created. Now, the ones I have in the first dot there, King George, Lancaster, Northumberland, Richmond, and Westmoreland are all down in that area between the Potomac and the Rappahannock down towards Fredericksburg or east of Fredericksburg. So that's all what we traditionally refer to in Virginia as the Northern Neck. And then the next are in the Piedmont area where you're coming west: Clark, Fairfax, Fauquier, Frederick, Loudoun, Page, Prince William, Shenandoah, Stafford, and Warren are that next level. And then the last list are counties that are presently today in West Virginia that are part of that land grant: Berkeley, Grant, Hampshire, Hardy, Jefferson, Mineral, and Morgan. So all of these counties were created out of Virginia, or created in Virginia, but today the ones in the last list are actually in West Virginia. The ones in the middle are kind of in our area. And I mentioned Stafford. The first grants here are going to be in Stafford County. Even the first grants of land here in Loudoun County are be in Stafford. I think Stafford was created in 1664. And then Prince William was the first county to carve out of that. That was 1731. And then out of Prince William, they cut Fairfax out in 1742, and then Loudoun in 1757, and Fauquier in 1759. And Frederick and Shenandoah, Warren, Page, and Clark are all on the other side of the mountain. So these are counties that were carved out. And what happens is you create a county when you have enough population to justify having a separate county. So when you're dealing with the court records and stuff, if you were living in this area early on, you'd have to go to Prince William. And I think I'm trying to think of the name of the town out there. Anyway, they've had 3, I think, courthouses in history. One was in the present day is Manassas, and before that was in Haymarket. And then there was one, I'm thinking Bristow, but that may not be but anyway, there was an earlier courthouse farther down. And I think they had a Dumfries courthouse at one point in time, Prince William. But anyway, you would have to travel there if you were living in Loudoun and were dealing in the court down there. Well, then once they created Fairfax, you would travel to Fairfax. And then after that, they had the one in Leesburg, so the courthouse was in Leesburg. So over time, as more population is, you form a new county. And so the counties would be formed from the previous one. But that's part of what this granting out of the land by Lord Fairfax says, is to increase the population. Now, I've used the term grant. Also, the term patent is used. The Commonwealth of Virginia issued patents. Government issuance of land is a patent, and a proprietary, like Lord Fairfax, is a grant. But practically speaking, we use those words interchangeably. They do mean something different, but quite often we refer to a grant as a patent and a patent as a grant, and so they're in common parlance, they were used the same way, but they're two different, that depends on who you got the land from. A warrant is a document giving authority to obtain a survey of land. Without the warrant, the process doesn't start. So you go to the granting authority and you ask for a warrant for so many acres of land. And then a survey is done. And the survey will go out and map the property, giving you metes and bounds as to where the property is. So all of the grants that they issue, I'll just pass this one grant out and let y'all look at this. There's only a few in the class today, I guess you can pass it over there. Anyway, it gives you the metes and bounds in it when they give the grant out. So they actually put the survey in the grant. The survey can be completed and the grant never exists. So you can't have a survey without a grant, but you can't have a grant without a survey. So once the survey is done, then, and the grant is made, then the survey is included within the grant. People doing research on land grants love to research land grants because they all have surveys in them. So trying to locate the land seems to be a little bit easier because the survey is contained in it. In a deed, you don't have to include the survey in it. I've taught a class on deed research, so I won't get to any great extent about that, but I will distinguish between once you get the grant, you have a copy of that grant, and the grant is in the grant book at the proprietor's office, which, as I said today, is at the Library of Virginia. But if you sell the land will then be recorded in the clerk's office in the deed book. So if you're going down to the courthouse to research deeds, the first deed is going to be recorded in the courthouse, but the land grant that it came from won't be in the courthouse. So you can't find these land grants in the individual courthouses. Now this slide I just added this time. I didn't have that in my previous slide presentation because I wanted to show you that in some of the land grants books, they're actually plats. This is a plat of Goonie Manor. And you all know where Goonie Manor is? Front wall is right about here. This is on the spine of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I think it's about 6,000 acres. And I think Goonie Run is one of these funny looking lines going up and down here. I'm not sure which one it is, but anyway. And it was known as Goonie Manor. I like it because of the name, Goonie Manor. But anyway, I was doing property research over in Clark County, in Warren County. And so I came across this and I said, oh, it's got a beautiful looking, diagram up here. So I like that. So I won't ask Echo to focus this because it probably won't help them much, but I put it in the slide there so you can see what it looks like. But this isn't in Loudoun, this is actually in Warren County, and I think some of it may extend down as far as Page. Some of this land may be down in Page at the end here. I'm not 100% sure about that, but anyway, so that's a plat of Goonie Manor. Some of the land grant books have plats in them, but most of them do not. I think this came from Book D. The land grant books are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then after that it's page numbers, 1 to whatever, how many, 100. And then they switched to letters. So after Book 5, they started A, B, C, and D. Now I'm going to get to my sources. So now I'm going to talk to you less about history and more about how you use this information, how you learn about it. My first thing is a book, which is a biography basically. Virginia Barron, the story of Thomas VI, Lord Fairfax. This is by Stuart E. Brown Jr., who was the same person that wrote that article from 1967 in the Virginia Cavalcade magazine. So if you want more of a thumbnail thing, read the article. If you want to know seriously about Lord Fairfax, read the book. Anybody know where Lord Fairfax remains today?
In Winchester.
Correct.
The church.
He's buried at the Episcopal Church in Winchester, in the city of Winchester. He died in 1781. Now, the next resource is Virginia Northern Neck Land Grants, 4 volumes. Now, that book, all these books are upstairs in the library. These happen to be my personal copies, but they're upstairs and they're very useful. The next one are these 4 volumes, these red binders. They're on the bookshelf between the John Devine room and the Howard Clark room. So the 2 front rooms up there, they're on the shelf right that's in the hallway between those 2. And these were done by Gertrude Gray, and I really love these. I used to look at these all the time. I haven't used them too much recently, but I'll let you look at a couple of them. And basically, they're chronological. They go up to 1862. And they basically list the grants as they're given out. Now, they don't have the surveys in them, so you can't map the property based upon these books. But if you're looking for your ancestor, you can look in the index in the back and see if the name's in there to see if maybe they got a grant. So that's one way that you can use these books. And if you're looking for your property and you know who got the grant, then you can see for how much the acreage was and the year they got. So she has those lists in there, and they're very helpful to use that way. So that's my second source I cite there. And the third is Northern Neck warrants and surveys, these big tall brown books here. I only have 4 of these. The library has a 5th volume, which I didn't know about until, I'm not sure where you can buy them today, but maybe you still can, I don't know. The one thing my books have, I have something in my books that they don't have in the library. When I was mapping land grants, oh, that's volume 2, that's the wrong one. Need volume 3. When I was mapping land grants for Prince William County, I went and wrote in the margin on mine the grant number. Because I said, when you have a survey, then next step is a grant. Well, I've got the grant down, and I also have whether it's in Fauquier or Loudoun County, because I actually mapped the land grants for Fauquier and Loudoun County. And so I would check them off in here to see if maybe there's another one I didn't know about when I'm trying to find these properties. So I've made a marginal note in mine about grants that are in Loudoun and Fauquier. And as I say, in her list and in the red books that you're looking at, the grant says it's in the property that it was at the time of the survey. So if later a new county is formed, if the grant's in 1731, it might be part of Prince William, but it could actually be in Fairfax, Loudoun, or Fauquier as well, because they were all created out of Prince William. Or it may be in Prince William. So when the grant's made in a year, then a new county is formed, it may later be in another county. But the book will record it as the county it was in at the time the grant was issued. So anyway, then the survey books, I say they basically have by county, and they list all of the grants. I think it's chronological in here is what it is, yeah. So that's another source you can look for. You really don't need these for doing the grant maps, but you may need these from a genealogical standpoint to determine if your person had a survey done but never got the grant, and that'll show they're around. And the other thing that's helpful about the surveys is they'll list the chain carriers sometimes, and they'll also, have the surveyor's name. So sometimes early surveyors are listed. They've got separate lists in here sometimes of who the surveyors are. One of the surveyors had some distinguished career later. His name was Washington. He lived down here near the Potomac. Anyway, he surveyed for Lord Fairfax. One of the well-known names in Loudoun County is John Huff from Waterford. Waterford's a good Huff family's names there. They were Quakers, and John Huff was an extensive surveyor in this region as well. But also they would employ young people to be these chain carriers. I don't know if you know anything about chains from surveys, but the chain was actually a chain. And it has so many links in it. A pole, and they give measurements in these surveys by poles and chains. A pole is 16.5 feet, and a chain is 4 poles, so it's 66 feet long. And what always amazes me in these colonial period when they're going out there and doing these surveys, this land was full of woods and bushes and rocks and hills and whatever, and how they could get these chains straightened out. They would measure the chains, and then they'd move the chain. They'd say it's so many chains from here to there. It's like, I don't know, they had to do offsets, I'm sure, sometimes, and they're also crossing creeks and streams and stuff. So yeah, it was a real challenge. Today they use a machine, and they shoot a line out with a survey gun, so it's a lot easier today, but back in those days, they actually physically laid these chains out to measure the distance from point A to B.
How long was the pole again?
16.5 feet. And a chain is 4 poles, which is 66 feet. Now, we also, here in the library, I don't have those with me, they're still up in the cabinet upstairs. We have the Northern Neck grants on microfilm, 24 rolls, and Northern Neck surveys on microfilm, 22 rolls. So what Mrs. Gray has extracted in her book, and what Peggy Shomo Joyner has extracted in her grant books, are all on microfilm. They have the originals, not the books, but the originals, and they're upstairs on microfilm in the microfilm case. But who uses microfilm today, right? You want to digitize and online, right? Well, I'll get to that in a second. But anyway, I have two other good resources that I used that are in the library here. One is Cecil Odell's book, Pioneers of Old Frederick County. And on the cover here, I'll hand this over to you to look through. This is more for research west of the Blue Ridge. So if you're researching west of the Blue Ridge and any of those other counties, most of which were created out of Frederick County, you've got Cecil Odell's book, and he lists a lot of the land grants and tells you who got the grant and who they sold the land to and who their children were and stuff like that. So this is really a great resource for land out west. And you can use that as sometimes as well. And if you see that, as I say, the map on the front shows you that same survey, but it only shows the western portion of it, because that's all he's concerned about. And then the last resource that I cited is Beginning at a White Oak. This is a book by Beth Mitchell. Beth Mitchell is the Wynne Saffer of Fairfax County. Or maybe I should say I'm the Beth Mitchell of Loudoun County. Anyway, Beth mapped Fairfax County in 1760. She mapped Fairfax County in 1860. And she also did an original land grant map for Fairfax County that accompanies this book when you purchase it. You can buy this book from the publications office at Fairfax County. And she has some nice pictures in here and talks about all the land granting in Fairfax. So that's Beth Mitchell. So if you want to know about Fairfax County, Beth is the star. She's the person that has the information for you to go by. Let's see, I think I'm going to move a little bit further because I've given you all those good resources to go to. But as I say, some people prefer not to look at books and maps and things. They'd rather go online. So at the Library of Virginia, they have the Northern Neck land grants scanned and online. You can actually go online and search them. And you can go online and look at a map of the land grants, original land grants of Loudoun County at arcgis.com. Last month, Kristen Brown talked about mapping, and she mentioned this as well in her talk. Here's the online site. This is not interconnected live. This is just a screenshot I took from the Library of Virginia's website that shows their online catalog. And you can key in the name of the person you want to look up. Down here, usually when I do, I've already looked up Mrs. Gray's book and know the name and the number. So I'll search here. I'll click on this Northern Neck land grants right here, and it'll bring up a numerical listing. And then I can put in the grant number and page. The only problem I find doing that on this site is the page number and the screen numbers aren't in sync. So you might look at book A213 and it might turn out to be A215 or A216 because there's some extra pages in there that they've scanned that don't have a number in the book. So sometimes they're a little out of sequence. So just keying in the page and number, you can't quite find what you're looking for. Sometimes you have to play around with it. But now you can search by a person's name, and then it'll bring up the list, and you can click on that. So you can use that in multiple ways. And back to that, you can also search grants within Virginia. See, display for land grant, a land office, grants and patents. So that's the state of Virginia, and this is the Northern Neck here. So there are two different lists. And then this is, it's hard to read. I think this is very difficult to read, but I use a screenshot for that as well. This is the introduction page to that original land grants on ArcGIS. So it gives you all the description of what's in there and the map contents. But then me, I love maps. Maps are great things to use. And so this is a resource that I always look at. Original land grants that are ArcGIS. There's a printed version of the land grant map that's available. Very colorful. No, you can see, I think I got it. If I don't, it's too bad, right? So that's Loudoun County in all these nice colors. And on the map is a letter and number, or a number and a letter, a number and a number, that lists the land grants. So you can take this map and go to Mrs. Gray's book and see who got it. But the county, nice enough, makes a list that goes with the map. So this is on the bookshelf as well. There's a list up there, and it's next to my 1860 land maps because I'm considered the source. So when they indexed it under the same thing as my name. So this index is on the shelf over there in the Loudoun section. The interesting thing about this is that I find is it has the acreage that was granted, but it also has the acreage that's calculated for the GIS. So in some cases it's real close, sometimes it's fairly well off. But this is a land grant that was done this map was done in 2007 by the county. And I was telling Echo earlier when we were talking, because you can't really see it on the image on the map, or on the slide, which I've got in your handout. But down here at the bottom, they gave me credit for having done the research. Maybe that's a disclaimer so they can't say it wasn't their fault if I messed it up. But anyway, here in the map, this is B61. The one who have a red book for B61? Remember their numerical order.
B61.
B is boy.
Book B?
Yes, book B61.
I have
See, I'm
book
testing
B.
you on that.
Yeah, right.
You don't have it, all right?
I have book B at 86.
No.
So no.
Well, one of you must have it, because they gave you the first two books. But anyway, book B61 is what's known as the Goose Creek Tract. That was granted to Robert Carter III. I told you earlier, Robert King Carter was the richest man in Virginia. One of the reasons he was one of the richest men in Virginia was he was a pretty sharp fellow. So some of the largest tracts in the Northern Neck land grant were granted out to him and his family members. So that was about 12,000 acres where Oaklands is today that he granted out to his grandson. So there was a lot of shenanigans going on. There's actually 3 huge grants in this whole region that were granted to, the Frying Pan tract was granted by Fairfax did himself. And the Bull Run tract, which is on the south tip of the county and extends into Prince William, that was a small grant. That was only 41,000 acres. So he granted that to himself as well. So that's down where Manassas Battlefield is and all the way down to Gainesville, he owned all that land. So that's one thing you see, and you'll also notice some large grants on the top here, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. This is the Piedmont Manor right here, it's E502. And and along the spine of the mountain is E28. That's the manor of reeds. So there's some rather large ones on there, and there's some smaller ones. What the county did on the Loudoun map is they made it by year. So they use a different color key for the year. So you get some indication by looking at the map is the timing of the land being granted out. And much of this land that's yellow here, these small tracts out in the west, much of that was granted to Quakers coming down from Pennsylvania. That the Quakers up in Pennsylvania realized that there was land to be had, and they were getting grants. One of the things about Loudoun, when I was doing the research on that, there's a fellow by the name of Catesby Cock. Now, y'all probably don't know Catesby Cock, but Catesby Cock was the first clerk of Prince William County in 1731. So obviously, if he was clerk of the court, he was kind of a prominent fellow. But when they created Fairfax County in 1742, he's the first clerk of Fairfax County. So he may have been living in Fairfax at the time because it was part of Prince William, but he was first clerk of both counties. And on that land grant map, he has about 20 land grants. Now, not all are huge, but he had about 20 different land grants that he got. So he was in the land speculation business. And roughly about half the people on that map are what we call today absentee owners. They didn't live in the county. The Carters were that very type. Robert Carter, who owned Oatlands, never lived at Oatlands. I don't know if he ever set foot on the land. And the land was not really occupied by the Carters until 1803 when George Carter, his son, inherited it and moved there and built to what would become Oatlands Plantation. So that's another thing about land grants, is it gives you early ownership, it gives you surveys within those grants, but it doesn't tell you the people are there. They own the land, but a lot of them are just speculating, with some of them with the hope of leasing it out and getting the revenue off of it, or selling it, flipping it, and making a profit off of it when people want to sell it. So that's what people are doing during this time frame, is they're speculating the land to a large degree. Those people from Pennsylvania, the Quakers, they're usually settling on the land when they buy it. But a lot of these people are just speculative. They're coming up from the Tidewater area, and they're going to Lord Fairfax, and they're getting grants of property that they have no intent to live on. Now let's see, that's the first map. Oh, I have other maps. I have two maps. Loudoun County, Virginia, original land grants, sections A, C, and D. I brought A and C. In trying to find these maps, I got so many maps I couldn't find D, so I know I've got it there somewhere. I just had so many things in there. I don't have a map case. But these grant maps were done prior to my map of 2007 by a lady by the name of Nettie Schreiner Yantis. And she cut the county into 6 sections and was going to do 6 maps. And she did A, C, and D, which is a western bound, but she never completed the eastern area. So in 2007, when I went to the county, I was going to tell them that they could use Mrs. Yantis's research for the west, and I would supply the research for the east. But unfortunately, Mrs. Yantis, who was still alive, wouldn't agree to let us use her maps without paying her fee of $5,000. So I said, sorry, I don't have $5,000 to give you. County said, we don't want to give her $5,000. So I said, I guess I'm stuck, I got to do the research. So I researched all of the county. So mine aren't exactly like hers, they're very similar. She used the USGS quad maps as a base for her map, which is the same thing I used for my 1860 maps. It's very helpful in doing mapping. But she's got it laid out, and you can probably compare the two. Here's this one right here, and it looks pretty much like that. But I tried not to copy hers precisely because I didn't want to get sued for copyright infringement. So I actually platted all those out on DMapper and laid them out myself to decide where I thought the lines would go. And there's another thing that's different between hers and mine. She has some places here where she has broken lines. Broken lines mean that the property overlaps with another grant. And that's a big drawback to the land grants. Robert Carter granted his land out in 1727 to himself at Oatlands. And then next door, the grant was made in 1744. When the survey crew went out in 1744, they couldn't find those blaze marks on the trees from 17 years earlier. So they went right over the line sometimes. It's amazing that they didn't have more problems than they do, but it was difficult to make sure the lines lined up with previous grants, especially when they're that far apart in date-wise, and there are quite a bit of that. There's one out here I like. I don't know if y'all can see that here, but there's a red one out here. Yeah. It's kind of funny shaped like that. It may not be the one I'm thinking of. But yeah, some of these, this says I, book I. This one says book I. When you see these funny little pieces here, they tend to be survey errors where they had unclaimed land because the surveys had gaps in them. Well, what happened was these people like John Huff would go out there and they'd find there was a missing property that never got granted. So they'd go out there and file a claim for that land, and now they own 60 acres in the middle of nowhere because they missed it from the surveys, left a hole in the map. So most of the ones from Book I are being Loudoun County are ones where the surveyors have discovered there's a flaw in the survey lines. So they went out and got these little lines. There's one, I was trying to see which one it was, but there's one that's kind of interlocking. It almost looks like a wrench around these pieces of land because it wrapped around. And it was a late survey where they left out some holes in the map. So these astute surveyors discover land that hasn't been claimed, and then they apply for it. And they probably would sell it to the neighbors at some point in time to make a buck or two. So that's Mrs. Gray's map. There's 3 of those that she completed, A, C, and D, and those are all in the cases upstairs. I've used the drawer and folder number. I'm not sure whether those will change with Maddie's cataloging system or not, but at present those are good to go. They'll still have the maps, but it may not be at that point. You may have to use their map list to find it. They're designing a new cataloging system, and the maps will be included in the new cataloging system, where at present there's a separate map listing in the computer. Patents and Northern Neck grants of Fairfax County, that was the one that Fairfax County published that goes with Mrs. Now I'm drawing a blank on her name, Beth Mitchell, with Beth Mitchell's book, Beginning of White Oak. So this is a map of Fairfax County that has all of the grants on it, and the grant numbers are on there. I think she's actually printed the names of the people in here. So you can get, if you buy that Beginning of White Oak County, you get this map to go with it. But this map is indicated upstairs as well. And this is for Fairfax County, if you're interested in Fairfax County land. And then the last one there I have is Fauquier. Now there is a grant map up there that I'll have to think a minute about who did the map. It take me a while to get his name in my head here. But anyway, he did a map. This map is not in the case upstairs. This map was generated by the mapping office of Fauquier County based upon research by myself. Marty Hyatt decided that Fauquier should have a land grant map, which they did not have. And I said, well, Marty, Loudoun did it for me using their GIS. Once they put it in GIS, they can produce a map of any scale you want. You know, they can put it on 3 pieces of paper and cut it into sections, or they can do one large one like this. So she says, okay, we'll get the county to do it. So I got my quad maps out and I mapped the parcels, and then they put it on the GIS system. And today I have a map, and I think they decided to use the color system too as well. This is a northern Fauquier. See this big white blob? This is all Fauquier as well. That's the manner of leaves. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. There was a little disappointment, the fact that this is so large on their map, because this land was leased out. These were leaseholders, so they didn't get grants, they got leases. And that's what happened with this manor land, that it was leased out. So that's the Fauquier map. And at present, this Fauquier map is with Laura Christensen to be processed. So at some point in time, it'll be in the map cases upstairs. At present, it's not there, so you won't be able to look at that. And Fauquier County can actually generate one of those for you. I don't know what they would charge for it. But with Loudoun, they sell theirs for $10 along with this big detailed listing. You think they'd kind of print out more paper than $10 worth, wouldn't you? Anyway, but Fauquier had not formalized their process of issuing that out. But that again is an available resource. There's the map for Loudoun. I printed this off of their website, I think, yeah. And my name is down here somewhere, giving me credit. And now, this are 4 examples. I gave you these 4 examples because they're all in Loudoun County. This one says it's in Stafford. This one says it's in Prince William. This one says it's in Fairfax. And this one says it's in Loudoun. This is I-146, F-293, E-66, and 3-248. These are all in Loudoun, but they, at the time, 1709, 1739, 1731, Prince William was created. So now we're in Prince William. Previously, we'd been in Stafford. Then 1748, Fairfax was created in 1742. And then 1766, Loudoun was created in 1757. I won't test you on those dates, so don't worry about that. But anyway, that is one thing to keep in mind whenever you use the Stalgrave's books or the online resource enrichment, that those counties that they identify are going to be the county at the time the grant was made, not necessarily the county it is today. And every one of these you should be able to find on the map that I did in 2007. I want to talk about the first one though, and I think my next slide relates to that. Daniel McCarty, 1709. That's the first grant in Loudoun County is 1709. This is from the book Landmarks of Old Prince William by Fairfax Harrison. I think that's an excellent book. I wish I had done it myself, it's so good. You know, but anyway, quoting from that book, others from Westmoreland were doing so at this time, among them Daniel McCarty, who in 1709 was the first to take a land grant on the upper river at the Sugar Lands. Y'all know where Sugar Land Run is, or Sugar Land Island? No, you're not sure, Casey? Aren't you on the Heritage Commission? Anyway, that's down in eastern Loudoun,
Right.
Cascades area,
Okay.
Trump's Golf Course, all that stuff down there, that's near Sugar Land. Anyway, that was the first land grant, was on the Sugar Lands in 1709. Treaty of Albany, 1722. I would guess that Daniel McCarty never set foot on that land. Now, those surveyors had to come out there. Hopefully they didn't run across the Indians the day they were out there doing the survey, or they might have not finished the survey. But anyway, they surveyed the land for him, and I can show you where that is on the map. That's a bright orange color right here at the western area of the county, right along the Potomac River. Most of the early grants were right along the Potomac River. These people had apparently got the false impression in their minds that they would be able to use the Potomac River to access their property. I think one of the things they overlooked was something called the Great Falls. If you ever tried to run a boat up the Potomac River, you'd encounter the Great Falls before you get to Loudoun, and I don't think you'd be able to get that boat up the river. You might be able to take it by land and portage it up to pass the falls, but if you had some hogsheads of tobacco that you were shipping downriver, I think you'd have a hard time getting them down to Georgetown, don't you think so? Well, later they would build a canal down there to deal with that. But early on, there wasn't any canals, and so the Great Falls was a real impediment. So even though Mr. McCarty took the first land grant there along the Potomac, and Mr. Lee came along later and got some land just outside of Leesburg, I don't think they were going to find getting it to their property was too easy using the Potomac River. And so that was an early grant, but here also in Landmarks of Old Prince William, it quotes the following. Following McCarty's Sugarlands grant of 1709, there was a long interval before other surveys were made on the upper river. So it was a long time after 1709 before the next grant. I think one of the Lees probably got something about 1720 or something like that, or 1713. So anyway, years went by before there was any more granting. And again, the thing I pointed out earlier was the Treaty of Albany. These people knew better than trying to settle up here prior to that, because if the Susquehannas came down from Pennsylvania, they would kill every white man they came across. They didn't, this was their land, this was their hunting grounds. They weren't about to allow white people to build property and settle it, plant crops, bring in slaves and livestock. This was their land and they would defend it. And so prior to 1722, this wasn't a place to be living. And I think that's another thing to point out about when Lord Fairfax finally inherited this land in 1735, they'd already come with this Treaty of Albany, but that didn't deal with what's west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. That was still Indian land as far as they were concerned. And you might send a few Scotch-Irish and Quakers out there, but you're not going to find too many Englishmen that want to live out there. I added this slide at the presentation I gave in Lovettsville because I realized when I was going up there that most of the land in Lovettsville area is part of the manors. The manor of Piedmont Manor that was granted to William Fairfax in 1736, 17,296 acres. That's this big yellow blob right here. Oh, excuse me, I'm wrong, that's not this. That's this orange blob right here. The big yellow blob is the Earl of Tankersville's grant. Tankersville and Piedmont Manor, these two big large tracts here. Lovettsville is right in here where these lines come together. That's the town of Lovettsville. This is a line that goes right through the town of Lovettsville. Most of those lands were not granted out except to those two people, and then they leased it out. Most of those Germans coming down from Maryland didn't have a lot of money. So they were willing to lease land in Virginia to farm on. And they'd get 100 or 200 acres and lease it and farm it. And so they never got a grant. They're not in the grant books. They're in leases. Some of those leases are recorded in the deed books, but not all are. So much of what Northern Loudoun was originally granted out in small, or in a large grant to people who are well-connected, like William Fairfax and John Colville, the Earl of Tankersville. And here's Shannondale, that's right over here next to the Shenandoah River. That was also to William Fairfax. And to himself, went too far, didn't I? To himself, Lord Fairfax granted 125,000 acres in 1736 along the spine of the Blue Ridge Mountain, extending to the east into what would become Fauquier County, the Manor of Leeds, 125,000 acres. Now, as history goes forward, Lord Fairfax, living in Frederick County at Greenway Court, and he dies and is buried in Winchester in the year 1781. You know what happened else in 1781? Here's the history lesson for you. Down south of here, along the Chesapeake Bay, there was a battle in a place called Yorktown. And at Yorktown, they say the world was turned upside down. The British Army surrendered to the Americans. Lord Cornwallis gave up his whole army and went back to England. Of course, the French fleet had a lot to do with that. But anyway, we won our independence at Yorktown. 1783, a treaty was settled. Well, Lord Fairfax is dead, and his heir lives in England. All right? We fought a war to gain our independence. You think we're going to respect land ownership of people in England? Lord Fairfax's heirs didn't think we would. They were afraid we would confiscate his remaining land. All of the land that's in the Northern Neck that hadn't been granted out reverted to the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia would grant that land out. So grants after 1781 made in the Northern Neck were made by the state of Virginia. But what about the land that he'd already granted himself? Here in 1736, 125,000 acres. What's going to happen to that? A lot of that is leased. People out there are renting that land. Y'all ever heard of the Free State in Fauquier County? One of the reasons they refer to it as the Free State, Marshall is the capital of the Free State. If you want to get a proximity of where the Free State is. The story they used to tell is when you went to the Free State, you'd ask people, am I in the Free State? And they'd say, no, it's down the road farther. And you ride down the road farther, and they'd say, no, the Free State's farther down the road. People were ashamed to have referred to them, they were in the Free State. Well, one of the stories with the Free State is that after the Revolution, these people said they're not going to pay rent to Lord Fairfax anymore. They paid rent when they were English citizens, but now they're Americans. And they're not paying rent to any English tyrants. So it got to be known as a Free State. There's other stories as to why they call that the Free State, but that's one of the historical references about the Free State over there. Anyway, there were some Americans who were pretty sharp, though, decided they could make a couple dollars if they offered some money to buy that land. The revolution's over. You ever heard of a guy named John Marshall? He was a Supreme Court justice. But prior to that, he lived out in a place called Salem, which is today Marshall, in Fauquier County. And he and his brother John Marshall, James Markham Marshall, and their brother-in-law, Raleigh Colston, the three of them decided, we're gonna buy this land from the heirs of Lord Fairfax. Well, they didn't have the capital to write off. They had a banker up in Pennsylvania who was supposed to finance it, but the deal fell through. But eventually, around 1802, they purchased that 125,000 acres in Fauquier County, Loudoun County, Clark County, and Warren County. And they had an enormous swath of land. And when I did my 1860 maps of Loudoun, the Colston brothers still own the land on the top of the Blue Ridge Mountain in Loudoun and Loudoun and Clark. And the Marshalls still own all this land down here in Fauquier, pretty much. They hadn't sold it. They still own the land in 1860 that made up the Manor of Leeds. They had so much land, they were just leasing it to these same people who Lord Fairfax had been leasing to previously. They may not pay rent to the fellow in England, but they're going to pay rent to the Marshalls because they own the land and they live right there. They're their neighbors. So they're going to collect their leased land, and if they don't, they'll have them evicted. So that's what happened to Lord Fairfax's land. Was he died and still owned it at the time, and it went to his heirs who were in England. But rather than hold on to it and have it confiscated by the US government, they decided, no, we'll sell it. We'll take what we can get for it and get out from under. The state did take the remaining land in the Manor of Leeds, in the Northern Neck Proprietary, but the leased land, those people, like William Fairfax, he sold. Fernando Fairfax eventually inherited from him, and then he sold it off later. I don't think there are any Fairfaxes that still own land in Loudoun County, but I can't swear to it that there aren't. All right, well, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to address them. I think I'm at the end of the slides. You look confounded, Kate.
No, I didn't realize